Blood doesn't always roar in your ears. Sometimes it just freezes. Clara stopped breathing when Richard's damp hand slid down her spine, his hot breath reeking of stale coffee and entitlement. She froze, calculating the cost of her paycheck against her dignity, just like every other time. Then came the quiet scrape of a leather shoe against the linoleum. Leo stood in the doorway. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't yell. He just looked at Richard with eyes like dead pavement, whispering a promise of absolute ruin. The neon sign outside the window of Northside Logistics buzzed with a sound like a dying wasp. It cast a sickly, intermittent red glow over Clara's desk, illuminating stacks of manifests, unpaid invoices, and a half-empty mug of lukewarm green tea. Clara Hayes lived her life in a state of perpetual, low-grade exhaustion. She was 26, but her bones felt older. Survival in a city that bled you dry for rent and groceries didn't leave room for youthful exuberance. She worked as the senior logistics coordinator, a fancy title for the person who fixed everyone else's mistakes for barely above minimum wage. She stayed because she had a younger sister in a residential care facility across town, and Northside offered a halfway decent health insurance plan. That insurance came with a heavy, suffocating tax. His name was Richard Davies. Richard was the regional manager. He was a man composed entirely of soft edges and sharp malice. He wore suits that were a fraction too tight, drowning himself in a cologne that smelled like synthetic pine and desperation. He was the kind of man who never explicitly crossed the line in front of HR, but lived his life firmly planted on its boundary. "Looking a little tired today, Clara," Richard murmured, appearing behind her chair without warning. Clara didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching gave him a thrill. "Just going through the end-of-month discrepancies, Richard. You work too hard." He leaned over her, bracing one hand on her desk and the other on the back of her chair, effectively boxing her in. The smell of his cologne was overpowering. "You need to learn to relax. Maybe I could buy you a drink after we wrap up the Miller account." "I have to visit my sister," Clara said, her voice a flat, deadpan monotone. She kept her eyes locked on the spreadsheet on her monitor. If she looked at him, she knew she would see that wet, knowing smile. "Shame," Richard sighed. He pushed off her chair, letting his fingers graze her shoulder blade on the way up. It was a calculated touch. Plausible deniability. "Keep at it, then." Clara exhaled only when the heavy wooden door to his corner office clicked shut. She rubbed her shoulder as if she could physically wipe away the sensation of his hand. It was a daily routine, a cynical dance of endurance. You swallow the bile, you do the work, you pay the bills. That was the reality of the world. No one was coming to save her. Until Thursday. Thursday was the day the silent partners came in to audit the books. Northside Logistics was a legitimate business, but even the lowest-level clerks knew it washed money for people you didn't look at too closely. Clara didn't ask questions. Ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was job security. Leo Costello was one of those people. He didn't swagger. He didn't wear flashy jewelry or suits that screamed his net worth. Leo dressed in charcoal and midnight blue, clothes tailored so perfectly they looked like they were woven directly onto his frame. He had dark hair, perpetually shadowing a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and left out in the cold. He moved with a terrifying stillness. Where Richard took up space with noise and sweat, Leo consumed the air in a room simply by existing in it. He usually went straight to Richard's office, stayed for an hour, and left. But lately, things had shifted. It started 3 weeks ago. Clara had been working through her lunch break, gnawing on a stale granola bar, when a heavy ceramic mug slid onto her desk. Plumes of steam curled from the dark liquid. She looked up, startled. Leo was standing there, his hands resting in the pockets of his slacks. "Black tea," Leo said. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges, like tires on loose gravel. You don't drink the coffee here. Smart. It tastes like battery acid. Clara stared at the mug. Thank you, Mr. Costello. Leo, he corrected quietly. His eyes, a pale, piercing grey, swept over her desk, lingering for a fraction of a second on the framed photo of her sister, then moving back to Clara. He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He just observed her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. Take a break, Clara. The freight will still be here in 10 minutes. He had walked away before she could formulate a response. Since then, it became a quiet routine. A nod in the hallway, a delivered cup of tea. Once he had paused by the copy machine to silently unjam it for her, his large, scarred hands working the plastic levers with surprising gentleness. He never asked her for anything. He never lingered too long. But Clara could feel his eyes on her. It wasn't the predatory, crawling sensation Richard gave her. It was a heavy, anchoring weight. She told herself not to read into it. Men like Leo Costello didn't notice women like Clara Hayes unless there was an angle. She was a cynical woman by necessity, and fairy tales were for people who didn't have past due medical bills. But as the days grew shorter and the Boston winter began to bite, she found herself looking up at the door every Thursday, waiting for the quiet click of his shoes on the tile. It was a Tuesday night, pushing past 8 o'clock. The rest of the office had emptied out hours ago, leaving behind a profound, hollow silence, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of freezing rain against the single-pane windows. Clara was trapped in the financial quarterly reports. The numbers were bleeding together on the screen. Her neck ached. A sharp knot of tension coiled tight at the base of her skull. She typed in the final sequence of digits, hit save, and let her head fall back against her chair, closing her eyes. Still here? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She snapped her eyes open. Richard was standing at the edge of her cubicle. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes had a glassy, unfocused sheen. He had been drinking. The sharp tang of whiskey cut through his usual pine cologne. Just finishing up, Clara said, her voice tight. She immediately reached for her purse on the floor, abandoning the idea of double-checking her work. I'm heading out now. Hold on. What's the rush? Richard stepped into a cubicle. It was a small space, too small for two people. Too small for a man who smelled like cheap liquor and bad intentions. My sister. Clara lied smoothly, standing up. She needs a call before lights out. She can wait 5 minutes. Richard didn't move out of the way. He stood dead center in the narrow opening of the cubicle. You've been working so hard, Clara. I see it. I appreciate it. You know I appreciate it, right? Thank you, Richard. Excuse me. She tried to step past him. He shifted his weight, blocking her path. The sickening smile on his face widened. I feel like we don't connect. Not really. I try to be a good boss. I try to be a friend. But you're always so cold. I prefer to keep things professional. Clara kept her voice even, suppressing the rising tide of panic. She gripped the strap of her purse until her knuckles turned white. Calculate. If she shoved him, he would stumble. He was drunk. But tomorrow, she wouldn't have a job. Tomorrow, the insurance would be gone. Professional. Richard mocked softly. He took a half-step closer. Clara hit the edge of her desk. There was nowhere left to back up. Professional is boring. You're too pretty to be this boring, Clara. He reached out. Clara turned her head sharply, but he didn't go for her face. His heavy, damp hand clamped down on her shoulder, his thumb pressed into her collarbone. The touch was possessive, bruising. He leaned in, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against her cheek. Just relax, he whispered, his other hand coming up to rest on her hip. Clara's mind screamed. The cynical survivalist part of her brain was shutting down, rapidly being replaced by raw, primal flight instinct. She opened her mouth to tell him to back the hell off. Consequences be damned. A heavy metallic click echoed through the empty office floor. It was the sound of the main entry door locking. Richard froze. He didn't let go of Clara, but his head snapped toward the corridor. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. The unmistakable sound of leather-soled shoes on cheap linoleum. Clara felt a bizarre, icy calm wash over her. She knew that footstep. Leo rounded the corner of the cubicle bank. He was wearing a black trench coat over a dark suit, his shoulders dusted with melting snow. He stopped 10 feet away. The silence that descended on the room was absolute. It was a physical pressure, heavy and suffocating. Leo didn't look at Richard. He didn't look at Clara's face. His pale grey eyes were locked onto the exact spot where Richard's hand was gripping Clara's hip. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Costello," Richard stammered. The alcohol-induced bravado vanished, replaced instantly by a high, reedy note of sheer terror. He dropped his hands from Clara as if her skin had suddenly caught fire. I didn't know you were coming in tonight. The quarterly review isn't until Thursday." Leo slowly raised his eyes from Clara's hip to Richard's face. The expression on the Don's face was utterly blank. There was no anger. There was no rage. There was only a terrifying, hollow emptiness that promised violence. "I forgot my ledger," Leo said. His voice was a whisper, soft and deadly calm. I can go get it for you," Richard offered, taking a step away from Clara, desperate to put distance between himself and the man standing in the aisle. Leo didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a dark monolith in the flickering fluorescent light. He finally looked at Clara. His eyes swept over her pale face, the tense line of her jaw, the way she was clutching her purse against her chest like a shield. Something dark and terrible fractured the ice in Leo's gaze. It was a momentary slip, a flash of something so violent and possessive that Clara felt her breath hitch in her throat. He turned his attention back to Richard. "You're in my way, Richard." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He tried to force a chuckle, but it sounded like a wet cough. "Right. Sorry, Mr. Costello. Just going over some late numbers with Clara here. Dedicated worker, you know." He took a step out of the cubicle, intending to scurry past Leo down the main aisle. He didn't make it. As Richard drew level with him, Leo moved. It wasn't a sprawling cinematic brawl. It was a masterclass in brutal economic violence. Leo's right hand lashed out, gripping Richard by the throat. The momentum of the grab slammed the regional manager backward. Richard hit the edge of a filing cabinet with a sickening thud, the wind leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss. Clara gasped, stepping back against her desk. Leo stepped into Richard's space, pinning him against the metal cabinet. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice a single decibel. He pressed his forearm against Richard's windpipe, just enough to cut off the air, just enough to make the man's eyes bulge with panic. Then, with his left hand, Leo reached down and took hold of Richard's right hand, the same hand that had just been resting on Clara's hip. Leo gripped Richard's fingers. He bent them backward. Richard tried to scream, but the pressure on his throat turned the sound into a strangled, gurgling squeak. His face turned a mottled purplish red. His feet scrabbled against the carpet. "Look at me," Leo whispered. The sound carried perfectly in the dead silence of the office. Richard rolled his terrified, watery eyes toward Leo. "I'm going to explain the reality of your situation to you," Leo said, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing stock prices. He increased the pressure on Richard's hand. A sharp, wet pop echoed in the quiet space as a joint dislocated. Richard convulsed, tears streaming down his face, choking on his own spit. "You breathe the air I allow you to breathe," Leo murmured, leaning in closer. "You sit in the chair I pay for. You run the business I own. You are nothing but a minor convenience to me. Do you understand?" Richard nodded frantically, his eyes pleading. Leo leaned in closer, his lips mere inches from Richard's ear. Clara stood paralyzed, watching a monster strip off his human suit. "If you ever touch her again." Leo's voice dropped to a register that rattled in Clara's chest. "If you look at her, if you speak her name, if you even think about breathing in her direction, you're dead. I won't just kill you, Richard. I will erase you. I will make it so painful and so drawn out that you will beg God for hell just to escape me." Leo twisted the hand another fraction of an inch. Another snap. Richard let out a muffled whimper, his knees buckling entirely. The only thing keeping him upright was Leo's forearm against his throat. "Nod if you comprehend," Leo commanded softly. Richard nodded violently. Leo held him there for 3 more agonizing seconds, letting the sheer terror marinate in the man's veins. Then he let go. Richard collapsed onto the cheap grey carpet like a sack of wet laundry. He curled into a fetal position, cradling his ruined hand against his chest, gasping for air in ragged, pathetic sobs. Leo didn't spare him a second glance. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and meticulously wiped his hands. He dropped the handkerchief directly onto Richard's head. Slowly, Leo turned around to face Clara. The silence rushed back in, broken only by Richard's pathetic wheezing on the floor. Clara was pressed flat against the window, her heart threatening to crack her ribs. She was looking at a killer. She had always known what he was, abstractly. But seeing the casual, effortless cruelty of a man who dealt in human lives, shattered the glass wall of denial she had built. She expected him to be angry. She expected the cold, dead look to be turned on her. Instead, as Leo looked at her, his posture softened. The terrifying tension bled out of his shoulders. He took a slow step towards her, stopping respectfully at the edge of the cubicle. He didn't trap her. He left her a clear path to the door. "Get your coat, Clara," Leo said. His voice was no longer the gravelly whisper of a murderer. It was calm, grounded. "I'm taking you home." Clara's voice shook. She swallowed hard, trying to find her cynical armor, trying to find the tough, unbothered woman who survived this city. She couldn't. "My car is in the lot." "Leave it," Leo said. "I'll have someone bring it to your apartment tomorrow." He looked down at Richard, a flicker of profound disgust crossing his features. "You aren't coming back here. You'll be placed at a different firm by tomorrow afternoon. Better pay, better hours, no garbage." Clara looked at him, her chest heaving. "Why are you doing this?" Leo stood in the harsh, flickering light, a dangerous man in a dangerous world, looking at an exhausted woman as if she were the only real thing left in it. "Because," Leo said softly, his pale eyes holding hers with unyielding gravity. "You shouldn't have to freeze every time someone walks into a room. Let's go." The Boston air was a physical assault. It hit Clara the second she pushed through the heavy glass doors of the North Side Logistics building. A wet, freezing slap that finally jump-started her stalled lungs. She dragged in a sharp breath, the damp cold tasting like exhaust and salt. Behind her the door clicked shut. Leo followed her out into the sleet. A black SUV idled at the curb. It wasn't flashy. It was a heavy utilitarian block of dark metal with tinted windows that absorbed the sickly yellow streetlights. As they approached, the driver's side door opened, and a broad-shouldered man in a heavy wool coat stepped out. He didn't speak. He just pulled open the rear passenger door and stood aside. Clara stopped on the pavement. The sleet was already soaking through the thin fabric of her coat, freezing her collar to her neck. She looked at the open door, then at Leo. "I can take the tea," she said. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual cynical armor. "The station is only 3 blocks away. Get in the car, Clara." It wasn't a request. It was a flat, immovable statement of fact. She got in. The interior smelled of expensive leather, ozone from the heater, and faintly of Leo's clean, sharp soap. It was a stark contrast to the stale cigarette smoke and desperation she was used to breathing. Leo slid in beside her, the door shutting behind him with a heavy, vault-like thud that severed them from the noise of the city. The driver pulled away from the curb smoothly. For 10 minutes, the silence in the car was absolute. Clara kept her knees pressed together, staring out the window at the blurred, streaking lights of the city. Her mind was a chaotic loop of the last 20 minutes. The wet crack of Richard's hand, the terrified, gurgling sound he made, the total lack of emotion in Leo's eyes as he did it. She squeezed her eyes shut. She was 26 years old. She managed spreadsheets and argued with truckers about fuel surcharges. She didn't belong in the back of an armored SUV with a man who casually dismantled people. "You're hyperventilating." Leo's voice broke the quiet. He hadn't moved. He was looking straight ahead at the partition separating them from the driver, his hands resting loosely on his thighs. "I'm fine," Clara lied, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid jerks. "You're calculating," Leo said quietly. He turned his head, fixing those pale, storm-grey eyes on her. "You're sitting there, trying to figure out what you owe me. You're trying to figure out if you traded one predator for another." Clara swallowed hard. The blunt honesty caught her off guard. She turned to face him, the anger of exhaustion finally cutting through her shock. "Did I?" she asked. Leo held her gaze. The streetlights washed over his face in rhythmic intervals, highlighting the sharp angle of his jaw and the faint, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "If I wanted to hurt you, Clara, you wouldn't be sitting here arguing with me. And if I wanted to touch you, I wouldn't need to corner you in a cubicle to do it." It was an arrogant statement, but it wasn't a boast. It was delivered with the same chilling certainty he had used with Richard. "I needed that job," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "My sister is at the Oak Creek residential facility." Leo interrupted smoothly. "She requires physical therapy 3 times a week, a specialized diet, and round-the-clock monitoring for seizure activity. It costs you $6,000 a month. You were drowning." Clara froze. The blood drained from her face. "How do you know that?" "I own the freight company, Clara. I own the building it operates out of. You think I don't know everything about the people who work for me?" Leo reached into his inner jacket pocket. Clara flinched slightly. He paused, his eyes narrowing at her reaction, before slowly withdrawing a sleek, silver smartphone. He tapped the screen twice. "Oak Creek is paid up through the end of the year," Leo stated. "No!" Clara shook her head violently. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in her chest. "No, you don't pay my bills. I don't take money from you. I won't owe a man like you." "You don't owe me anything," Leo said, pocketing the phone. "People like you don't do favors for free." Clara snapped, her voice finally rising. She hated the desperation in it. She hated that he had stripped away her independence with a couple of screen taps. "What is the angle? What do you want?" Leo leaned forward, invading her space just enough to make her breath catch. He didn't touch her, but the sheer gravity of his presence pinned her to the leather seat. "I watched you for a year," Leo said softly. "I watched you come in early, exhausted. I watched you eat cheap food so you could pay for a facility you rarely have time to visit. I watched a rat like Richard Davies circle you because he knew you were too desperate to fight back." He stopped, his jaw clenching for a fraction of a second. "I am a man who fixes broken systems," Leo continued, his voice dropping to a rough rumble. "Your life was a broken system. I fixed it. Accept it." The SUV pulled to a smooth halt. Clara looked out the window. They were parked outside her apartment building in South Boston. The brick facade was crumbling, the front security door had been broken for 6 months, and a harsh yellow streetlight flickered violently over the trash cans. "My driver will be here at 8 tomorrow morning," Leo said, leaning back into his seat, restoring the distance between them. "He will take you to your new office. You'll sign the paperwork. Your salary is tripled. Your medical benefits are comprehensive." Clara gripped the door handle. She felt entirely unmoored. The cynical worldview that had kept her safe was useless here. "Why, Leo?" she asked one last time, her voice cracking. Leo looked out his own window, refusing to meet her eyes. "Because it offended me that you had to worry. Go inside, Clara. Lock your door." The morning light was unforgiving. It filtered through the cheap vinyl blinds of Clara's bedroom, casting harsh, striped shadows across the scuffed hardwood floor. Clara sat on the edge of her mattress, fully dressed, staring at the wall. She had slept for exactly 2 hours. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the wet snap of Richard's fingers. At exactly 7:55 a.m., there was a heavy, rhythmic knock on her apartment door. She walked into the living room, her steps heavy. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The same broad-shouldered driver from the night before stood in the dim hallway. He held out a familiar set of keys, her car keys, and a thick manila envelope. "Miss Hayes," the driver said. His voice was a deep baritone, surprisingly polite. "My name is Arthur. Your vehicle has been detailed and parked in the secured lot 2 blocks over. The parking fees are covered for the year." Clara stared at the keys dangling from his thick fingers. She took them, then accepted the envelope. "Thank you, Arthur. My car is downstairs whenever you are ready." He didn't wait for a reply, simply turning and heading down the creaking staircase. Clara went back into her kitchen and sat at the wobbly Formica table. She tore open the envelope. Inside was a sleek, heavy stock folder bearing the logo of Apex Global Freight. It was an import-export firm operating out of the Seaport district. Legitimate. High-end. She flipped open the employment contract. Logistics director. She scanned the numbers. Leo hadn't lied. The salary was staggering. It was enough to move out of this terrible apartment. It was enough to buy her sister the specialized wheelchair she desperately needed. It was enough to actually breathe. She flipped to the signature page. At the bottom, already signed in a sharp, angular scrawl, was the name, Leonardo Costello, Chief Executive Officer. Clara traced his signature with her index finger. It felt like a trap, a beautiful, velvet-lined trap. She was trading a sleazy middle manager for a man who ruled an underworld empire, a man who broke bones with the casual indifference of a person snapping a dry twig. But as she looked around her kitchen, at the leaking faucet, the cracked linoleum, the stack of past-due utility bills sitting on the counter, the cynicism that usually protected her felt flimsy and inadequate. She grabbed her coat and walked out the door. Arthur drove her to the Oak Creek facility first. She needed to see Chloe before she made a decision that would bind them both to a monster. The facility was bright, smelling of antiseptic and lavender. Clara walked down the long corridor to room 214. Chloe was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the morning traffic. She was 20, but her fragile frame and the severe contractures in her hands made her look much younger. "Clara," Chloe smiled, her speech slow and deliberate. Clara knelt beside the chair, taking her sister's twisted hands in her own. "Hey, Bug. How are you feeling today?" "Good. The physical therapist said I'm getting stronger." Chloe looked at Clara's face, her brow furrowing. "You look different. Not so tired." Clara swallowed the knot in her throat. "I got a new job, Chloe. A really good one. We aren't going to have to worry about the bills anymore." Chloe's eyes widened. "Really? You don't have to go back to that place with the bad man?" Clara's breath hitched. She hadn't realized Chloe knew about Richard. She had tried so hard to keep the toxicity of her life away from her sister. "No," Clara whispered, squeezing Chloe's hands. "I never have to go back there again." "Good," Chloe said firmly. "I didn't like how you looked when you came from there. You looked grey." Clara stayed for an hour, feeding Chloe her breakfast and brushing out her hair. When she finally walked back out to the waiting SUV, her resolve had hardened into something cold and sharp. She would take the job, she would take the money, but she would not become a pawn. "Arthur," Clara said as she climbed into the back seat, "take me to Apex Global." Apex Global Freight did not look like a front for organized crime. It occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass spire in the Seaport District, overlooking the harbor. The lobby was expansive, paved with white marble, and manned by security guards in tailored suits who looked less like rent-a-cops and more like private military contractors. Clara bypassed the reception desk. She clutched the manila folder to her chest like a shield. She didn't wait to be announced. She followed the directory to the executive suite on the 32nd floor. The woman sitting outside the CEO's office was striking, efficient, and clearly expecting her. "Miss Hayes," the assistant said, standing up. "Mr. Costello is finishing a call. You can go right in." Clara pushed open the heavy oak doors. The office was massive, bathed in natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Leo was standing behind a massive mahogany desk, phone pressed to his ear. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose heavy forearms corded with muscle and faintly marked by old, faded ink. He finished his conversation in rapid, fluent Italian, hung up the phone, and looked at her. He didn't look surprised. He looked exactly as he had the night before, impossibly still, a quiet storm contained within a bespoke suit. Clara walked to the center of the room and dropped the folder onto his pristine desk. The smack of paper against wood echoed loudly. "I am not a rescue dog, Leo," Clara stated. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute terror vibrating in her chest. Leo looked down at the folder, then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. "Good morning to you too, Clara. I went to the facility," she continued, refusing to let him derail her. "I saw the balance. You paid off $80,000 in medical debt overnight. You tripled my salary. You gave me a car detail, a driver, and a job I haven't interviewed for." "You're qualified," Leo said calmly. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away from her. He leaned his hip against the edge of the mahogany, crossing his arms over his chest. "I reviewed your work at Northside. You were running that branch single-handedly while Davies drank his lunch. Apex needs a logistics director who doesn't cut corners." "Stop it!" Clara snapped. "Stop pretending this is just business. Men like you don't do this out of the goodness of their hearts." Leo's expression darkened slightly. The air in the room seemed to pull tight. "Men like me? And what kind of man is that, Clara?" "A killer," she said. The word hung in the air, blunt and dangerous. "A mobster, a criminal. I'm cynical, Leo, not stupid. I know what Northside was. I know what you are." Leo didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He just watched her, his pale eyes tracking the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. "And yet you're standing in my office yelling at me." Leo murmured. "You have a spine, Clara. I've always admired that about you." "I didn't come here for your admiration," she fired back. "I came here to set the ground rules." Leo tilted his head, a faint, dark amusement flickering in his eyes. "Ground rules? For me?" "Yes, for you," Clara said, stepping closer, driven by a sudden, reckless surge of adrenaline. "I will sign the contract. I will take this job because my sister needs it and because I refuse to go back to being a victim. I will run your logistics department flawlessly, but that is where it ends." She pointed a finger at his chest. "You do not own me. You did not buy me by paying off a hospital bill. I will not be your project. I will not be your pet. And I will definitely not be collateral when your real business catches up with you. If I work here, I work here. Nothing else. Silence stretched between them. It was a heavy, loaded silence. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she felt lightheaded. She had just given orders to a mafia don. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to reach out and remind her exactly how dangerous he was. Instead, Leo uncrossed his arms. He reached out, his hand moving so slowly she had time to pull away, but for some reason, she didn't. He gently caught her raised hand. His fingers were warm, rough with calluses, a stark contrast to his pristine environment. He didn't squeeze. He simply wrapped his hand around hers, lowering her pointing finger. "Are you finished?" he asked softly. Clara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, good." Leo didn't let go of her hand. He took a single half-step closer, eliminating the space between them. Clara had to tilt her head up to look at him. Up close, she could see the tiny flecks of silver in his grey eyes, the exhaustion hiding in the corners. "Rule number 1, Leo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that settled deep in her bones. "I don't buy people. If I wanted a pet, I'd get a dog. I gave you this job because you earned it, and because leaving you in that rat trap of an office was no longer an option I was willing to tolerate." His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. Clara shivered. "Rule number 2, he continued, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "You are not collateral. You are out of bounds to everyone in this city. No one touches you. No one looks at you sideways. You are safe here." "And rule number 3, Clara whispered, finding it difficult to draw a full breath. Leo's grip tightened just a fraction, a possessive, anchoring weight. The detached, cold persona was gone, replaced by a raw, quiet intensity that was infinitely more terrifying. "Rule number 3, Leo murmured, leaning in until his breath ghosted across her cheek. "Stop pretending you're not terrified. Stop pretending you have to carry the weight of the world by yourself. You fought your war, Clara. Let me fight the rest." He released her hand and stepped back, retreating behind his desk. The sudden absence of his heat left Clara feeling strangely cold. "Your office is down the hall. Glass doors. Margaret has your access badges," Leo said, his tone shifting back to the smooth, detached CEO. He sat down and pulled a file toward him. "We have a board meeting at noon. Be ready to present the new shipping routes." Clara stood there for a moment, completely destabilized. She had walked in ready for a fight, ready to defend her cynical independence. But Leo Costello hadn't fought her. He had simply disarmed her, stepping past her armor with terrifying ease. She turned and walked toward the door. As she gripped the brass handle, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Leo was already writing in the file, his face a mask of concentration. She had laid down the law. She had told him he couldn't own her. But as Clara stepped out into the hallway and looked at the nameplate bearing her title, she couldn't shake the unsettling realization that Leo Costello didn't need to buy her. He was just going to wait for her to surrender. She went by Hayes now. The name on the frosted glass of her office door read C. Hayes, Director of Logistics. She preferred it. The girl who used to flinch at the sound of heavy footsteps in the North Side logistics basement felt like a distant, fading memory. Hayes was someone new. She was well rested. Her sister Chloe had a state-of-the-art motorized chair and a physical therapist who actually smiled. The crushing, suffocating weight of poverty had been surgically removed from her life. It had been 6 weeks since the night the rain froze on her collar, and Leo Costello rewrote her reality. Ipex Global Freight was a machine. It ran on silence, precision, and an undercurrent of lethal efficiency. Hayes fit into it perfectly. She didn't ask about the unmarked crates that occasionally bypassed customs in the middle of the night. She didn't ask why half the security staff carried themselves like ex-special forces. She did her job. She optimized supply chains, cut fuel waste by 14%, and completely restructured the European import routes. She survived by dealing in numbers. Numbers were safe, they didn't lie, and they didn't hold hidden agendas, which was exactly why the numbers on Route 44 were keeping her awake at 11:12 p.m. on a Tuesday. The seaport district was quiet, the black waters of the harbor reflecting the scattered lights of the Boston skyline. Hayes sat at her massive oak desk, her bare feet tucked under her, staring at 3 glowing monitors. Route 44 was a standard shipping lane bringing textiles from southern Italy into the port of Boston. On paper, it was flawless, but Hayes had spent her entire adult life finding the lies in other people's math. She pulled up the fuel consumption logs. She cross-referenced them with the dry weight manifests and the ship's displacement drafts. A cold knot formed in her stomach. The fuel burn was wrong. A cargo ship carrying textiles didn't burn diesel at that rate unless it was fighting a massive headwind for 2 straight weeks, which the weather data proved false, or unless the ship was sitting substantially lower in the water than the manifest claimed. Something was on those ships, something incredibly heavy, and it wasn't on the official books. Hayes didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess herself. The cynical survivalist in her knew that in a legitimate company, you flagged an anomaly to HR. In a company run by the mafia, an anomaly meant someone was stealing from a man who broke bones for sport. She printed the logs, shoved the papers into a manila folder, and walked out of her office. The executive suite was mostly dark, save for the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Light spilled from the gap at the bottom. 2 men stood outside. One was Thomas, the quiet, massive driver who still picked her up every morning. The other was Dominic, one of Leo's lieutenants. Dominic wore flashy suits, smiled too much, and looked at Hayes like she was a stray cat Leo had dragged in out of the rain. "Miss Hayes." Thomas nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "I need to see Leo," Hayes said. Dominic checked his gold Rolex, a condescending smirk pulling at his lips. "It's late, sweetheart. The boss is going over the quarterly cash flow. Why don't you go back to counting paper clips?" Hayes didn't look at Dominic. She kept her eyes on Thomas. "Thomas, if I don't walk through those doors in the next 10 seconds, a federal RICO investigation is going to gut this company by Christmas. Open the door." Dominic scoffed, stepping into a path. "Listen here, you little... Let her in." The voice came through the heavy oak. Low, gravelly, absolute. Thomas smoothly stepped in front of Dominic, placing a massive hand on the lieutenant's chest, and opened the door for Hayes. Leo was at the head of the conference table, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. The table was covered in ledgers and blueprints. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his grey eyes stark in the harsh overhead light. But the moment Hayes walked in, his entire physical focus shifted to her. The tension in his jaw softened. "I found a blind spot," Hayes said, walking straight to the table. She didn't wait for permission. She dropped the open folder over his ledgers. Leo didn't look at the papers. He looked at her. "You're here late. Route 44. Hayes continued, ignoring his observation. She tapped the spreadsheet with a manicured fingernail. "It's supposed to be hauling Italian silk and raw cotton. High volume, low weight. But look at the fuel consumption over the last 4 transatlantic crossings." Leo finally dropped his gaze to the numbers. His mind was sharp. He saw the discrepancy almost immediately. A faint, dangerous crease formed between his brows. The fuel burn implies a massive weight increase. Hers said, her voice dropping into the cold, clinical register she used when dismantling a broken system. "Someone is piggybacking on your legitimate manifest. They're loading something heavy, machinery, munitions, gold bullion. I don't know. but they are using your ships to move it, and they are hiding the weight by falsifying the displacement drafts at the port of origin. The room grew terrifyingly quiet. The air pressure seemed to drop. Leo traced the column of numbers with his index finger. Who signed off on the loading manifest in Naples? Hayes flipped to the second page. Dominic. The silence shattered. The conference room doors slammed open. Dominic stood in the threshold, his face flushed red, his hand hovering dangerously close to the inside of his suit jacket. Thomas was right behind him, a suppressed pistol already drawn and pointed squarely at the base of Dominic's skull. "She's lying!" Dominic spat, his eyes darting frantically from Leo to Hayes. "She's a glorified secretary, Leo. She doesn't know how the old world works. You're going to take the word of some civilian over a made man?" Leo didn't shout. He didn't even stand up. He just leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of lethal composure. "She isn't a civilian, Dominic," Leo murmured, his voice laced with frost. "She's the only reason you aren't currently being indicted by the DEA for trafficking unauthorized weapons on my ships." Hayes felt a jolt of shock. Weapons. The heavy cargo was weapons. Dominic's face lost all its color. He knew the math didn't lie, and he knew Leo had just done the math. The lieutenant made a fatal miscalculation. He panicked. He lunged forward, bypassing Leo, aiming straight for the weakest target in the room. He grabbed Hayes by the upper arm, hauling her backward and yanking a snub-nosed revolver from his jacket, pressing the barrel hard against her ribs. "Back off!" Dominic screamed, his composure entirely dissolved. "Thomas, drop the gun or I blow a hole through her spine." Hayes didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The girl who had cowered in front of Davies was dead. She looked down at Dominic's hand on her arm. She felt the cold steel digging into her side. And then she looked across the table at Leo. Leo Costello had stopped breathing. The quiet, controlled CEO vanished entirely. In his place was the apex predator of the Boston underworld. The sheer, unadulterated violence radiating from his eyes was blinding. "Dominic," Leo whispered. It was a sound that belonged in a nightmare. "Take the gun away from her ribs." "I'm walking out of here, Leo," Dominic panted, dragging Hayes backward toward the glass walls. "I'm taking her to the elevator, and I'm gone. You try to stop me, I'll drop her." "You underestimate her," Leo said softly. Hayes didn't need another cue. She didn't wait to be rescued. Dominic was focused entirely on Leo and Thomas, expecting an external threat. He wasn't paying attention to the logistics director. Hayes slammed her heavy 3-inch stiletto heel down with all her weight, driving the metal spike directly through the leather of Dominic's shoe and into the fragile bones of his instep. A sickening crunch echoed in the room. Dominic howled, his grip on her arm slacking for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Leo needed. Leo vaulted the heavy mahogany table with terrifying speed. Before Dominic could raise the gun, Leo's hand clamped around the cylinder of the revolver, preventing it from rotating. With his other hand, Leo struck Dominic in the throat. It was a precise, devastating blow. Dominic dropped the gun and collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his ruined foot and his crushed windpipe. Thomas stepped forward seamlessly, kicking the revolver across the carpet and dragging Dominic up by the collar of his expensive suit. "Take him downstairs," Leo said, his chest heaving slightly. He didn't look at the traitor. "Find out who paid him to move the guns, then make him disappear." "Yes, boss," Thomas grunted, dragging the wheezing man out of the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The silence rushed back in, thick and heavy with adrenaline. Hayes stood by the glass window, her chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged breaths. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow tremor in her hands. She had just assaulted a mafia hitman. She had just watched a man get condemned to death. She expected to feel horror. She expected the crushing weight of guilt. Instead, she felt an electric, terrifying sense of clarity. The world was brutal. It was entirely unforgiving. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't the prey. A sudden sharp sound broke her reverie. A heavy drop of liquid hitting the mahogany table. She turned. Leo was leaning heavily against the edge of the table, his head bowed. Blood was dripping from his left hand, pooling on the polished wood. When he had grabbed the cylinder of the revolver, the sharp metal of the sight had sliced a deep, ragged gash across his palm. "You're bleeding," Hayes said, her voice sounding oddly steady in the quiet room. Leo looked down at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. "It's nothing. Superficial." He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, but his fingers were slick, and he fumbled. Hayes crossed the room. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out and took his injured hand in hers. His skin was burning hot, calloused and rough, slick with bright red blood. The contrast of his dark violence and the vulnerability of the open wound struck her deeply. "Sit down," she ordered. Leo looked at her, his pale grey-eyed searching her face. He was looking for the terror. He was looking for the disgust that normal people felt when the curtain was pulled back on his world. He didn't find it. He slowly sank into a nearby leather chair. Hayes walked over to the executive bar in the corner. She bypassed the scotch and grabbed a clean linen towel, a bottle of clear vodka, and the small first aid kit kept under the counter. She returned and knelt on the floor between his parted knees. "This is going to burn," she said flatly. "I'm aware," Leo murmured. He didn't brace himself. He just watched her. Hayes poured the vodka directly over the gash. Leo didn't flinch. Not a muscle in his face twitched. He was completely focused on the way her hands moved. Efficient, careful, surprisingly gentle. She dried the wound with the linen cloth, her thumb pressing against his pulse point to steady his hand. His heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm, completely at odds with the violence that had just occurred. "You didn't freeze," Leo said quietly, the gravel in his voice scraping against the quiet room. Hayes unrolled a sterile bandage. "I told you, Leo, I'm not a rescue dog. I know how to survive." "Surviving is hiding," Leo countered, leaning forward slightly. The proximity was intoxicating. He smelled like gunpowder, copper, and expensive cologne. "You didn't hide. You fought back. You broke his foot." "He was ruining my supply chain," Hayes said, wrapping the gauze tightly around his palm. It was a deflection, a cynical shield thrown up to hide the fact that her hands were shaking. Leo reached out with his uninjured hand. He didn't grab her. He simply placed 2 fingers under her chin, applying a feather-light pressure, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "Stop," he whispered. The command wasn't about the bandage. It was about the armor. "You saved my empire tonight," Leo said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air evaporate from her lungs. "My best men missed the anomaly. They looked at the ships and saw cargo. You looked at a spreadsheet and saw a ghost. You dismantled a threat that would have put me in a federal penitentiary." Hayes swallowed hard, the knot in her throat suddenly massive. "It's my job. Your job is logistics," Leo corrected softly, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. The touch was electric, sending a sharp thrill down her spine. "What you did tonight was loyalty." "I don't belong in this world, Leo," she breathed, her cynical defenses crumbling under the weight of his stare. "I'm a girl from Southie who clips coupons and yells at truckers. You run the city. You run the machine that keeps the city moving," Leo countered. He leaned closer. "You think I want someone who belongs in this world? I am surrounded by murderers, thieves, and liars. I live in the dark, Hayes. You are the only person who looks at me and sees something worth fixing." He dropped his hand from her chin and cupped the side of her face. The warmth of his palm, the slight roughness of his skin, was an anchor. I told you the day you walked into this office. Leo murmured, his lips a breath away from hers. You are out of bounds. No one touches you. Dominic broke that rule. He is going to die for it, and I don't feel a shred of remorse. The raw, unvarnished truth of his confession shattered the last wall between them. He wasn't pretending to be a good man. He was offering her exactly what he was, a monster, entirely devoted to keeping her safe. Hayes leaned into his touch. She closed her eyes, the exhaustion of fighting the world alone finally breaking her. Then don't let them touch me, she whispered. Leo let out a ragged breath. He closed the distance, capturing her lips in a kiss that was entirely devoid of hesitation. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, heavy, and intensely possessive. It felt like a claiming. Hayes didn't pull away. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, answering heat. The sterile, cold environment of the boardroom melted away, replaced by the overwhelming reality of the man in front of her. When they finally broke apart, the silence in the room felt different. It was no longer heavy with adrenaline. It was thick with a new, terrifying permanence. Leo rested his forehead against hers. You're bleeding. Hayes blinked, confused. She looked down. The side of her white silk blouse was stained with a small patch of red. Dominic's gun sight had caught her when she stomped on his foot. She hadn't even felt it. It's just a scratch, she said dismissively. Leo's eyes darkened, the silver in his irises flashing dangerously. He stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. He didn't let go of her hand. Come on, Leo said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Where are we going? My penthouse. Leo hit a button on his desk, summoning his private elevator. I'm cleaning that cut. And then you are going to sleep. I will handle the rest of the garbage in this company. Hayes looked at the mess on the conference table. The blood, the ledgers, the discarded gun. A few hours ago she would have panicked. She would have calculated the cost, the risk, the potential for ruin. Now she just looked at Leo. She saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. Okay, she said simply. The penthouse was exactly what Hayes expected, and yet entirely surprising. It occupied the top 2 floors of a luxury high-rise overlooking the Charles River. It was vast, silent, and decorated in stark, minimalist tones of charcoal and slate. But there were signs of humanity scattered throughout. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen island, a stack of worn history books on the coffee table, a vinyl record player sitting next to an impressive collection of jazz albums. It was the home of a man who craved quiet. Leo led her into a massive marble-tiled bathroom. He sat her on the edge of the sunken tub and retrieved a first aid kit that made the one in the office look like a toy. He didn't speak as he worked. He carefully unbuttoned the side of her ruined silk blouse, his knuckles gently grazing her skin. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of inflicting. He cleaned the shallow scratch on her ribs with antiseptic, his jaw clenched tight. It really is just a scratch, Leo, Hayes whispered, the silence stretching too long. He put a gun to you, Leo replied, his voice barely a rasp. He taped a piece of gauze over the cut, his fingers lingering on her waist. I watched a man hold a weapon against your ribs, and for 3 seconds I didn't know how to guarantee your survival. I have never been powerless in my entire life. I hated it. He looked up at her, the mask of the untouchable mafia don completely gone. He looked exhausted, haunted. You weren't powerless, Hayes said, reaching out to touch the faint scar above his eyebrow. You stopped him. You stopped him, Leo corrected, a faint, dark smile touching the corners of his mouth. You put a stiletto through his foot. I think I'm slightly terrified of you, Hayes. Good, she breathed. You should be. I manage your spreadsheets. I know exactly how much you spend on dry cleaning. Leo let out a low, rough laugh, the sound vibrating against her palms. He leaned his face into her hands, closing his eyes for a moment. It was a gesture of complete, uncharacteristic surrender. The man who ruled the city with an iron fist was actively seeking comfort from the woman who balanced his books. What happens tomorrow? Hayes asked, the logistical side of her brain refusing to completely shut down. The weapons on Route 44, the people Dominic was working for, they're going to realize their shipment isn't coming. Leo opened his eyes. The softness vanished, replaced by cold, calculating steel. Tomorrow, I send a message. Leo stated calmly. The weapons will be dumped into the Atlantic. The people who bought Dominic will receive his Rolex in the mail, covered in his blood, and they will learn that Apex Global is no longer vulnerable. He stood up, offering her his uninjured hand. But that is tomorrow's war, Leo murmured, pulling her up against his chest. Tonight you are going to sleep, in my bed, and I am going to stand outside the door if I have to make sure you know you are safe. Hayes looked at him. The cynical girl from Southie would have bolted. She would have called an Uber and run back to the leaking faucet and the crushing debt, preferring the devil she knew. But Hayes wasn't that girl anymore. She had walked through the fire, and she had found a man who didn't want to burn her. He wanted to watch the world burn for her. You don't have to stand outside the door, Leo, Hayes whispered, her hands sliding up his chest to wrap around his neck. Leo's breath hitched, his arms banded around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply, as if drawing his life force directly from her skin. Are you sure? He asked, his voice muffled against her collarbone. Once you cross this line, Hayes, I won't let you go. I will give you anything you want. I will burn down anyone who looks at you wrong, but I will not let you walk away. It was a warning. It was a promise of total, inescapable possession. I'm not going anywhere, Hayes answered, pressing a kiss to the side of his jaw. Someone has to fix your fuel efficiency ratios. In the dark, quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, high above the dirty, violent city, Leo Costello finally stopped fighting the war in his head. He picked her up, her legs wrapping instinctively around his waist, and carried her into the bedroom. The transition was complete. She had started as a victim, a casualty of a broken system run by men like Davies, who, rumor had it, was currently managing a rat-infested basement warehouse for a rival company, jumping at shadows and drinking himself to death. She had become the director, the anchor, the bleeding edge of Leo Costello's empire. She didn't need a fairy tale. She had reality. And the reality was that the most dangerous man in Boston belonged entirely to her. If your heart was pounding when Hayes finally took control and stood her ground in the boardroom, you are not alone. That is the power of a woman who knows her worth, and the dark, unyielding devotion of a man who will burn the world down to keep her safe.